I'm ahead of the curve, also known as James Bergman, and in today's video I present 11 essential philosophy books you should read. In no particular order, I begin with Ian McGilchrist's The Master and His Emissary. Now, of course, you could say that this is not just a philosophy book, this is also a psychology book, this is also a neuroscience book, it is also a book that covers culture and behavioral science and things like that at different points throughout, because it is a fairly long book. It's about 500 pages and the font is quite small actually, so it is a very, very tough book to get through, not only because it is very dense in terms of the information, but also it is a bit long. But I want to reassure you of the fact that it is an incredible book. It's a brilliant book because Ian McGilchrist is a psychiatrist, but he is also very proficient in science and psychology and philosophy. And this book kind of has a lot of everything. It has discussion of God, it has discussion of culture, of art, of different philosophers such as Nietzsche. The title, The Master and His Emissary, is fundamentally referring to the right and left hemispheres of the brain and how they interact with each other and how that has a connection with these philosophical topics that are brought up throughout the piece. Overall, this book blew me away. I do have a full review of the piece on my channel. Some of you may have seen it already, but I thought that this deserves to be in this list of 11 essential philosophy books you should read because it really has incredible scope, and McGilchrist has some controversial ideas about the frontal cortex and the brain and how it interacts with the world. It's, as I said, a very difficult book to get through, to read, but it is wholeheartedly worth the effort as far as I'm concerned. Next on the list we have Informal Logic, A Pragmatic Approach by Douglas Walton. This isn't the first time that I've mentioned this book and recommended it, but I feel like when I'm presenting this kind of video, okay, what are the 11 essential books? What are the essential books that I would personally recommend from my experience of reading this kind of literature? You know, I've read, at this point, probably like 80 or 90 philosophy books, so I was kind of going through my collection and what I've read. This one is a book that I recommend to everybody, even if they're not necessarily interested in philosophy alone, because this book, as you guessed it, is about logic, but you might be thinking, oh, well, that's kind of syllogisms and boring and mathematical. The great thing about this book is that it is on informal logic, which is not the maths, not all the syllogisms necessarily, but there are, but it isn't formulated in a way that's confusing or mathematical. Douglas Walton, throughout the book, teaches informal logic, which is essentially how to spot different fallacies, holes in arguments. It is a fundamental book, as far as I'm concerned, to read if you like philosophy, and in particular, if you want to learn a bit about logic as a subject, because it is quite daunting when you first hear about it, like, what is logic? It sounds very confusing and complicated, and don't get me wrong, it is, but this book, Informal Logic, I would 100% recommend for anybody who has not read this before. Even if you're more interested in, let's say, psychology, this book gives you life lessons that you can apply in the real world, whereas one criticism of philosophy books in general is that sometimes you can't necessarily apply them, and if you do, you might be seen as a madman. But actually, if you apply what's in this book, you're just going to become more effective in conversations, in debates, arguments. And as many of you guys know, sometimes it is good to engage in those kind of scenarios. And this book will ensure that you know how to spot bad or good arguments when you're in that situation. Nietzsche's The Gay Science, also called The Joyous Science. My edition is Penguin and it has The Joyous Science on. It's kind of comedic that they changed the name to Joyous because of all the connotations with the other alternative name which Nietzsche intended. But let's be honest, we know what he meant, right? We know what he meant. The Joyous Science, now, Nietzsche has many, many good books, right? And I'm the first to admit my love for Nietzsche, and I've read many of his books at this point. And the one that sticks out to me as being the most accessible and probably one of the most interesting is this piece, right? And it is precisely because Nietzsche covers so many different topics: culture, art, God, atheism. he covers so much ground in this book, and it's a mix of aphorisms and poetry by the end. And so it's probably the best book to start Nietzsche off of, because Beyond Good and Evil, look, everybody knows about that book. It is a great book, but is it very accessible for the new reader? I would definitely contend on the negative. I would say no, Beyond Good and Evil is not a great book to start Nietzsche off with. I personally did, and it wasn't necessarily a mistake, but I was kind of lost throughout the book. Whereas this one, there's 5 individual books within this book, as Nietzsche intended, with all a different idea, a different thing that he's tackling, but all of them are interlinked nevertheless. So yeah, if you want to read a Nietzsche book, I would certainly say this is the most accessible, and it covers the most amount of areas that you would want to read if you're looking for just the essentials of philosophy. Next, we have Practical Ethics by Peter Singer. This book in particular is very, very good because it is an overview of ethics as a topic, and Peter Singer is known to be one of the most successful and captivating and brilliant ethicists of our time. So Peter Singer is definitely the author to go to in this context. But this particular edition is good because it has been universally acclaimed for being fantastic, and it's even been used in schools for many, many years. An incredible account of ethics, like animal ethics and the trolley problem. And I would personally say this book is worth checking out. The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. Oh, wow. I adore this book. This is one of my favorite books of all time that I've ever read. I really love this book, and this particular edition I'm also in love with. It's absolutely beautiful. Everyman Library, they have really, really magnificent covers and books, so I'd recommend looking into that publisher in particular, as well as, of course, Penguin. The Prince is effectively a job application, right? Because Niccolo Machiavelli, the author, he was a political advisor in Florence. He loved Italy, he loved Italian culture, and he wanted to protect it at all costs. But unfortunately, he was accused of treason. He was exiled from Florence, and he retreated to his villa a number of miles away from Florence, and you could actually, from his villa, see the tip of the Duomo in Florence, which is a beautiful sight. If you haven't been, I would highly recommend seeing that. If you're a fan of Machiavelli, of course, by the time you check this out, the reason why The Prince is so profound, and the reason why, in any case, I recommend this book as much as I would, let's say, Nietzsche's The Gay Science or Informal Logic, is that the information within it is timeless, and attempts of it being replicated don't hit the same spot. Right, this is the book on political philosophy. And the reason I say it's a job application is that Machiavelli sent it to the current prince. I think it was Lorenzo, if I remember correctly. And he wrote this as kind of an advertisement of his skills and his knowledge, so they would hire him again, so he could come back from exile to Florence and start working again. But there is no evidence that it was even read, right? But they did publish it eventually, and it was very controversial. And the reason why this book overall is fantastic is that, like I said, it is political philosophy, but it's much more than that. It teaches you how to command effectively, how to deal with other people who are in disagreement with you. And of course, there's that quote, right? It is better to be feared than loved, if not both. There are so many brilliant quotes. And yeah, sure, the book can be somewhat dry at times, but I feel that the information, it's so practical, and it really gets you to think about, deception and war and how people rule successfully and how they go about that, right? How do you be a good ruler? Like, what are the things that you should avoid? What are the things you shouldn't? And the thing is, it's not only a book for somebody who wants to be some kind of king, right? It's for anybody. It's how to command rather than be commanded. It truly is a magnificent and motivating, historically interesting, cultured piece of writing that isn't even very long, right? It would probably take you like one day. If you read all day, it would probably take you that much time to get through it. It really isn't very long at all. And I would personally recommend getting a good edition such as this one, because there's an introduction and the writing is very accessible to read as well. I don't like small writing. It can get a bit tedious when you're reading pages upon pages of just words, right? So yeah, The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. without a single doubt, is one book you should have in your arsenal if you wish to understand philosophy as a subject better. Next, I have Graham Oppy's Atheism, the Basics. Graham Oppy is known as one of the leading academic atheists of the modern era. I have interviewed him myself. He's a nice guy. I had a really interesting conversation with him, so I would recommend you check that out if you're interested in atheism and religion and debating this kind of topic. The reason why I put this book on this list is that in the realm of philosophy, obviously, as I said, there's many subjects, but one of the main topics, of course, is the existence of God. Why I liked it is because of how concise and how straightforward and reputable Graham Oppy is as a philosopher of atheism and theology. He really is a very sophisticated thinker in that domain. There are many books on atheism that I could have put on this list, right? There are just tons. But from what I've read, this is one of the best books on the topic to introduce you, at the very least, to atheism. And what do atheists believe or lack a belief of, right? Is atheism a lack of belief in God or gods, or is atheism the belief that there isn't a God? So Graham Oppy addresses these kind of controversial questions and debunks other definitions of atheism that he doesn't agree with. His opinion to me is very high. I value it very highly because he is an academic atheist. He has done the groundwork, he has done the research, and I find his views and his perception of atheism to be the most reputable that I've read in the topic thus far. So I would recommend this book if you want to understand atheism better. For example, what does it mean to be an atheist? What is the difference between atheism, agnosticism, theism, and innocence, which is a term he coined himself? How is atheism being distributed over time and place? What does science tell us about atheism? Are there good reasons to be an atheist? Are there good reasons not to be an atheist? What do we mean by new atheism? The book addresses many different topics in this domain, and for that reason, and for many more, it is on this list. Next, we have The History of Philosophy by A.C. Grayling. Now, some of you may know that Bertrand Russell wrote his History of Western Philosophy, which I have behind me. I don't know if you can see. You probably can, or maybe not. I don't know. But I do have his History of Western Philosophy. The reason why I didn't add Russell's book, which is, of course, very critically acclaimed and everything like that, the reason why I added A.C. Grayling's book is because he doesn't only deal with Western philosophy. He actually deals with Indian philosophy, Chinese philosophy, Arabic, Persian philosophy, African philosophy. He really does do the groundwork as a whole on what do these different philosophers from different continents and countries, what do they tell us? What do they believe? What have they believed? Who are the different philosophers of these different subjects? This book is more overarching than Russell's History of Western Philosophy, and for that reason I do believe that it is worth checking out. You'll have a good overview of each philosopher. And when you read some of these books as well, you want to learn about Nietzsche maybe, or you want to learn about Peter Singer. There are many good names being dropped in here, and Grayling does a good job of including a lot of philosophers that are underrated, I would personally say. It's an essential read, without a doubt. It is a great handbook for when you're reading other books and you want to learn about African philosophy, or what is continental philosophy, what is analytical philosophy, like what did Russell do, for example? What about Carl Jung? Who are these people? What do they do? This book addresses all of these guys very succinctly within the piece. Theory and Reality by Peter Godfrey Smith. Again, this is a book that I have mentioned before, and for good reason. It is one of the best books on science and philosophy and critical thinking that I've ever read. It is a brilliant book which gives you an overview, of course, of the history and the progress of science, and philosophically kind of discerning which theories have been debunked or which ones have been affirmed. Peter Godfrey Smith also has a fantastic other book called Other Minds, which is more of a science book, but it's also a bit of philosophy. I would really recommend that. That's one of my favorite books of all time. But Peter Godfrey Smith really impressed me with this book as well in particular. So yeah, if you want to understand the scientific method and critiquing or affirming it in any way possible, Peter Godfrey Smith actually gives both sides a space to speak. And for that reason, I definitely found this book to be a useful and a fair analysis of different theories in science. Next, we have Hamza Zorsis's The Divine Reality. This book is on God, Islam, and the mirage of atheism. Now, I did want to add a book by a theologian on the list because if we are going to think critically about philosophy or the more specifically the existence of God, we can't just read books from guys we agree with, right? Like from Graham Oppy. I agree with Oppy. With Hamza, I don't agree with him on many things, such as the existence of God, but on many points I do agree with him, right? And so the reason why I'm adding this to this list is not only because I think this is one of the best books available on the topic, one of the best modern books on the topic. Hamza is an incredible speaker and presenter of all of these ideas, such as, do we have ultimate purpose? Did the universe come from nothing? Does evil and suffering negate divine mercy? Is God worthy of our worship? This book doesn't only talk about Islam, right? The majority of the time it talks about arguments for and against God, which ones might work, which ones don't, why don't they work? Hamza gives a very ingenuous account of all of these arguments and counter-arguments, which really surprised me. That's one of the reasons why I like this book the most, is that Hamza makes an argument, he puts forward a proposition for God, and then he writes not just one counter-argument of his argument, but actually like three. And he goes through these counter-arguments and explains why he believes that they are not valid and why his argument is true, perhaps. And so this is a very critical book on not only Islam, but of course on the God's existence and why atheism might not be consistent, why theism might be more reasonable. So in this domain of religious philosophy, the Divine Reality does win a spot in this list. The Wisdom of Insecurity by Alan Watts. A Message for an Age of Anxiety. It's been a while since I read this book, actually, but Alan Watts is one of the most popular representatives of an Eastern philosophy perspective of life in general and how we should kind of view what goes about in the world and different subjects like that in the Eastern domain. It's not a very long book either. It's actually very short. It's an exploration of man's quest of psychological security, spiritual and intellectual certainty in religion and philosophy. He talks about Zen Buddhism, which he is affirming throughout, of course. But Alan Watts is a brilliant communicator of ideas. And what the Wisdom of Insecurity does is it approaches religion and philosophy and spirituality from an angle that, a bit like Jiddu Krishnamurti in Freedom from the Known, which is another great book, which is similar to this one. But what I like about Alan Watts is simply his character and how likable he is. I mean, I could have easily put Krishnamurti on this list instead of this, but I think that both are equally as interesting and good to read. This book does offer a clarifying perspective of an Eastern philosopher, what they might think of the world, the modern world, and the West, and so on. It does address many issues in philosophy, religion, and perception, and phenomenology. Alan Watts is just a great guy. Like he has so many good YouTube videos and speeches and sermons, kind of. I mean, he does speak like a priest or like a vicar, kind of trying to motivate individuals or trying to be philosophical. But I find it to be quite inviting and entertaining to listen to him. But I know that some other people might view it as woo-woo. But again, we have to read what we might disagree with. So this book is worth checking out. Last on the list, we have Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. How could I not add this to the list? Marcus Aurelius's Meditations wasn't even supposed to be a book. It is his diary, it's his journal that he wrote over 2,000 years ago, which is insane, right? It really is insane. And the book is effectively the first self-help book. If we want to talk about it in terms of that category, it is definitely the first book on how can man improve his perception of himself and others. What can he do when he's facing suffering or hope? What can man do about that? Meditations addresses so many different philosophical questions, and he does it in a way that is very lyrical and engaging, despite it not even supposed to be a book in general to read by the public. I mean, it's that good that even Marcus Aurelius accidentally journaling his thoughts is the fact that it's now one of the most profound and useful and consistent philosophy books to this day is incredible to me. And without a single shred of doubt, Meditations earns its place on this list as well. Okay, right, we got through 11 books. Thank you for watching, everyone. I need to do more of these, actually. I need to do more videos of great philosophical fiction books or great existentialist books or something like that. I think that these videos are very useful for people who may be newer to the domain of philosophy, or even if they're not, like, they just, I mean, why wouldn't you want more philosophy books to read, right? Why not? Why wouldn't you want to give yourself more psychological torture? Anyway, on that note, thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.